Hi, and welcome to Talking to Investors, the Impact Startup Negotiations podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Alina Klarner of Impact Shakers. We discuss the deal Alina missed out on when a startup got too many funding offers and how the founder achieved that. Why great founders don't try to, win deals. They do something slightly different. And how giving up on competitiveness will give you a competitive edge. And there's this thread running through our conversation, which is Alina shares amazing stories and insights about founders and power. Let's get started. Hi, Alina, and welcome to Talking to Investors, the Impact Startup Negotiations podcast.
Hey, Ben, really happy to be here.
I'd like to start us off with a hot topic, which is how do founders handle the power dynamics of fundraising?
Very interesting question. Something that comes up definitely a lot for us working with diverse founders and founders from underrepresented backgrounds. And I think one of the things to think about or be conscious of here is sort of the power dynamics between asking for money versus bringing an opportunity to someone, offering an opportunity to someone. And we see this quite often that it's that founders from underrepresented backgrounds have a hard time asking for something, whether that's money or help or whatever in the first place. But then when it comes to fundraising, actually framing it in a way that means that they keep the power, so that it's them bringing an opportunity, offering access to an opportunity, rather than having to ask for something, in this case, money.
It's a question of reframing the whole conversation in a way that provides a sense of their own value and their own empowerment in a way, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, for themselves and for the person that they're talking to. So it basically is for everyone in the room, right?
Thank you. And this is a topic that we'll dive into deeper throughout this podcast. But, there's a burning question that all listeners have on their minds, which is, who is Alina Klarner? For example, what got you into investing into startups?
Right. So I started investing when I was working in private equity. And I was working for a B2B SaaS fund, so a fund investing in software companies. And I loved the companies. I loved the high growth scenarios. I loved working with them. I loved looking at all aspects from strategy to go to market to finance to operations. But I was really missing any kind of diversity. And I was really missing an impact aspect to it. And maybe that's a generational thing I get told off for, being a millennial that cares about purpose and this kind of thing. So I think that plays into it. But for me, it was really that sort of the search for more. And so I decided to do something about the situation and take my own money and start angel investing. So I started investing in predominantly female impact entrepreneurs, built a portfolio that way, and just got hooked and couldn't stop. So in 2022, it became my full-time job as an impact investor in diverse founders.
You are working with a VC fund called Impact Shakers.
Yes, that's right. I would describe it more as an ecosystem, because we try to bring together all aspects of this. So we do programs for diverse founders building scalable impact businesses to provide the education, the insight, equip them with everything they need. We provide capital. We have a friends and family fund for this, and are raising a VC fund that will sort of both follow a similar investment thesis. And then we do a lot of community building, because if we're thinking about impact problems, it will be problems like access to healthcare, like climate change, all big, hairy, complex problems that need all stakeholders to pull in the same direction to solve them. So we take this ecosystem approach to solve an ecosystem type problem.
That's really wonderful to hear. Lots of the other people I've interviewed also speak of the need to build communities and build ecosystem responses to the polycrises. So how many startups have you invested in so far, roughly?
As an angel, about 15 with Impact Shakers and about 9 so far. So let's call that 25-ish.
Great. That's quite a big bag of experience right there, huh?
I don't know. It's not enough. I see so much opportunity. We need to write so many more checks.
Okay. You were at a conference recently, right?
Oh, we've been to so many. So we've been to
Okay.
IFM in Paris. I was at the Gin Forum in Copenhagen, and we've recently returned from the Impact Europe conference in Turin. So there's been a lot of conferences, a lot of amazing conversations, and a lot of amazing community as well.
Let's hope you get some wonderful LPs on board.
Yes, that's the plan.
So moving on to, what kinds of startups you invest in. What's the typical level of maturity of a startup that you would invest in?
So we look at early stage companies, and that can mean basically anything from what you would traditionally call the friends and family stage. Although we're a bit reluctant to call it that because not everyone has friends and family who can fund the early stages of your idea or your startup, through to pre-seed. So I would sort of say pre-seed seeds is the sweet spot.
Do you have an industry focus?
Not as such. We focus on impact, and within that, we broadly focus on three aspects. So one is climate tech, which includes traditional climate tech, but also things like water, clean air, waste. Then there is inclusion tech, which includes things like silver tech, education, healthcare, access to financial services. And then there is what we call impact infrastructure, which is essentially everything that we are going to need to make the impact economy work. So this is rethinking supply chains. This is green and blue jobs. This is impact measurement. So those are the three big buckets: climate tech, inclusion tech, and impact infrastructure.
The last one, does that also include education?
Yes. Yeah. Specifically, when we think about, education across all stages of life, right? Because if you're thinking, for example, about green and blue jobs, there is a massive need to retrain, re-educate, develop new skills, etc.
Yeah. Next, I'd like to dive with you into the process of how startups reach out to you, get in touch with you, maybe have a meeting, and obviously, ideally, get an investment. Let's start off with this simple question. Roughly how many pitch decks do you receive per month?
The monthly number fluctuates a little bit on the calls that we have open at any point in time, but it's over 2,000 a year.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
If you took half an hour on each, that's lots of work time gone.
Yeah, definitely. It is. But I think it's also if you look at it from the other perspective, it's amazing because we get so many people saying that there is a pipeline issue when we're talking about diverse founders. And actually, we have a good friend of the Impact Shakers community, Imen. She always says it's not a pipeline issue; it's a problem. It's an issue with how you build your pipeline. So it's an infrastructure problem. And I think the fact that we get so many high quality deals in this space is a perfect example that the opportunity is there, the quality of deals is there, and just much more investment needs to flow into the space.
And how many startups do you end up meeting per year out of those 2,000 that you get as pitch decks?
In-depth discussions, maybe with 10% of them. Then a fraction of those move on to diligence. And we looked at the numbers recently. We have invested in 0.4%.
That's tough.
That is really tough. And I can't tell you how tough it is to make these choices in the end, because like I said, the quality is just phenomenal.
And how do you like to be approached by startups? Is it, the being sent a pitch deck or LinkedIn, email, warm intros? What's the kind of approach that most likely leads to a first meeting and a conversation?
This is a really interesting question because everyone says that cold outreach is the way to go, and you need to include it if you want to have diverse founders and all of that. And then we know that in the end, if we look at the stats, the deals that are most likely to get through are warm introductions. So it's something that we are really, really conscious of in terms of how we construct our calls. So we do pitching competitions, for example. We've done 2 pitching competitions this year, where we had over 600 startups that applied. So that's a way to basically open up the pipeline and give people a chance to, apply. And we look at every single one of them. And then there is obviously a lot of LinkedIn, and we have a partner network of over 200 organizations across Europe. So there were a lot of referrals from their programs, from their portfolios as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you advertise those partnerships too with your, the outreach partners?
Yeah, as well. So they share our calls, we share theirs. If they have opportunities, we share those on our LinkedIn and our newsletter. So it's a very community-driven approach.
And very collaborative.
Yeah. Because, like I said, 0.4%, we need to collaborate. more capital needs to flow into this space.
Yeah. Not everybody, and especially if you're looking at underrepresented founders, not everybody has a great network to start with. So would you say that's a trainable skill, to build a network and to become more empowered as a weaver of contacts and networks?
I would say it's a very necessary skill. Yes, definitely. And it's a great question. I love this question because indeed it is. Access to network is one of the biggest obstacles, right? Especially for underrepresented founders. So I actually have one example in mind of a founder that comes from, it's a Black founder in the UK from a low income background. So really sort of an intersection of different types of underrepresented. And the way, for me, this is just the gold standard in terms of how he built his fundraising pipeline. We met him at an event sort of 9 or 12 months before he even started raising his round. And he came, he introduced himself, he said, "This is what I'm building. I just wanted to meet you." And it was, a beautiful conversation. And then he just kept in touch every 2 or 3 months, sort of, in different ways. And in the end, when it came to his fundraising, he basically said, "Okay, now I'm ready. Let's have a conversation." And he had, in the end, people signing up to his round on the back of an email because he'd done so much work in terms of the leading up. So I think it's a long-term play. But I also appreciate that for a founder, this is a massive investment, right? Because you're trying to build a business. You are finding customers, selling to customers. You are trying to find investors, selling to investors. So there are a lot of things to balance. So I appreciate that this is not something that every founder is going to be able to do.
Some people have a natural tendency to go exactly that way, to start building relationships, build them over time, let them grow, let them flourish, because good relationships, that's exactly what they do, right? With time, they get deeper. And even though we're talking about a professional relationship, but somebody who's keeps getting in touch, keeps showing you slight moments of progress.
And it is, I think, one of the key points for me is a personalized approach, right? And again, this is a big investment in terms of time. But if I get, for example, a LinkedIn message where it says, "I love the work you do with Impact Shakers. I think there could be great synergies." And then it turns out it's a non-diverse team and it's a non-impact business. That they're out. Sorry. So there is a bit of I want to be seen as a person, and I want to be approached as a person as much as you want the same. So I think that is one of the key things that, yes, is a lot of work, but I think makes a big difference.
And you want to be seen also with your values and your criteria, your set of interests that you're working towards. Is there any chance I could get this founder on a podcast here? Because I'm just thinking it'd be such a great interview, right?
I'm sure you'd love it.
Yeah, okay, great. Because, the thing is, this is exactly the skill sets that founders need. I think there are some components of this that are trainable, and that excites me to think that, founders can get better at doing the kinds of outreach that doesn't involve sending off 300 emails and saying like, "Oh, it's a numbers game."
There is also a bit of expectation management to be done, right? Because there are so many factors that play into whether someone says yes or no to the opportunity, including the timing, where they're at with their portfolio, whether they're investing at the moment or not, whether they have competitors in the space that they've invested in. So there are so many aspects to it that even if it's a perfect fit, might mean it's a no. That to an extent, I think is also good to set your expectations that a no doesn't mean that you have a bad business or you're not good enough as a founder. Or indeed as a fund manager. I mean, we go through the same process, right?
Yeah, you do on the other side of the game, right?
Yeah.
We're closing in on the topic of success, and I'd like to ask you, what would you say are the, let's say, top three superpowers that make successful founders successful, especially diverse founders?
I'm going to say number one is deep expertise, because often with diverse founders, we find that they just have incredible lived experience and also incredible professional credentials. So they can, one, see problems that others don't even know exist. And two, they solve for communities or groups of people with just incredible insight and sensitivity. So I think this deep expertise, lived experience is one of the superpowers.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, we all know that diverse founders get less of the funding pot overall, so they have a harder time fundraising. So I find that often they're much more focused on building a sound business. They have sound business models before they even go out fundraising. And when they get funding, they do so much more with less. So it's this, and I would consider this a superpower as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is quite often they've had to beat the odds in life and developed incredible resilience. And that's basically exactly what you need as a founder, right? And what a lot of people look for.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And can I do a fourth one as a bonus?
Oh, please. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I have a bonus one. So the final thing that we often see with diverse founders is that they also build more diverse and inclusive teams. And it's the teams around them, but it's also their customers, their suppliers, their stakeholders, their investors. And we all know that diverse teams do better, right? They deliver more innovation, better returns, higher profitability. So I think that's my bonus one.
Thank you. That's a great bonus. Yeah. Let's get back to this topic that we started off with a little bit, the power dynamics and how startups interact with VCs. Do most startups that you encounter and that you start, building a plan to invest in, do they negotiate equity percentages with you?
Some do. Mm-hmm. some don't.
Okay.
But if they don't, we try to have, or just genuinely, we try to have very open conversations with people. Mm-hmm. To actually look at, and this can be as an informal conversation before they even launch a round. And this can be as parts, we did a fundraising program, our Raise program recently for diverse founders in Belgium, where we did this actually as a module, where we spent a lot of time talking through this. But it's that because it's always a bit of a balance, right, between how much cash do you need and can you get versus how much of your business can you afford to give away. And I think there is a lot in the market where basically early investors take a far too big of a stake, which then creates all sorts of issues along the fundraising journey. And a lot of founders basically go into it unknowingly, right? So they haven't thought through what happens in this round, the next round, the round after. And so we try to, when we see this kind of situation, have a conversation with the founders and say, okay, what are you trying to do with this business, right? How do you want to grow it? How fast do you want to grow it? What type of business do you as a person want to build and run? So I think there is, even if they don't, long answer, but even if they don't ask for it, I think there is a very important conversation to be had, because if people go in with expectations that are misaligned, it just creates all sorts of friction along the way.
And since you've seen the journey through to the end for a number of startups, I guess you also have the perspective on exactly that, right? Which is, like you said, what happens in the next stage of investment? How does the amount of equity you give away in the pre-seed affect the seed? And those kind of things that maybe some founders don't have on their radar, right?
Yeah, and like I said, it's a tricky balance, right? Because quite often VCs, for example, we hear stories of founders that VCs have told them to get some more angel money so that they can build some revenue, build some traction, and then they come back to the VCs, and the VCs say, "Well, but sir, you have a really messy cap table now." So it's that sort of, how do you manage that balancing act between the two, and also what is good practice, what is acceptable. And I think this also requires more conversations between investors, right? We recently did a panel on the role of impact angels in the impact investing space. And it was exactly the same conversation, that there isn't enough alignment between the funders at different stages or even in the same round.
You just mentioned different stages. And then, like if you think about going into the later stages of your first negotiation with the founders on the way to then making an investment happen, what do you expect from them? What skills should they have when they're negotiating terms with you?
The more we can have open conversations, the more everyone thinks along in terms of what they are trying to do, the more everyone has done their research. And if there's stuff that they don't know, not just smile and nod and hope for the best, but actually ask questions and try to get to the answers, the better the outcome, I think. Because I think there is still a lot of a bit of an expectation in the industry that you just, if you get VC funding, you know everything about VC funding, right? And so there's no space for anyone to ask stupid questions, when really we should all be asking stupid questions, because they're not stupid at all. They're the things that need to be said out loud so that you can find alignment.
Okay. There's obviously the asking the questions, also an attitude of perspective switching, if I understand correctly, right? Trying to figure out that deeper interests, alignment.
Yeah, and a collaborative mindset. And this goes for, I think, co-investors, investors at different stages, and startups alike. Because one of the things that I really struggle with is this sort of this competitive mindset, right? With this we have to win deals and try to push each other out. And like I said, we need so much more co-investment and collaboration in this impact space. That actually this is something that, in terms of an attitude, I think has to change a little bit. Because if we're thinking about, one of my favorite deals that we did was a startup in Spain, and neither of us is from Spain, right? We don't know the market in depth. So actually being able to co-invest with 2 Spanish impact funds was amazing for us, because we got access to their local knowledge. The founders got more funding because we co-invested. Plus, we were able to align expectations in terms of reporting for both financials and impact. So it was just, it was a win-win all round.
So, like you described it, there's a lot of competition right there, even between founders or startups as well, right? If you think about that, you only invested in 0.4% of the pitch decks that you saw. That's a tough number. How do people get past that inner stance of having to be competitive?
You still need to look out for yourself as a founder, the same way that investors will be looking out for their piece and the promises that they have made to their investors. But I think there is a lot more in the openness of the conversation, the kind of language we use with each other. And quite frankly, I mean, this point around winning deals, right? We had the question a lot, how we get into deals. Quite often founders invite us in because they want someone on their cap table that is from a diverse background, that has an impact angle, that works with a portfolio of diverse founders. So I think it's really also finding that value alignment. And if you are trying to build a business a certain way or in a certain space, finding investors and partners and advisors that understand the space and that want to help you build the business in the way that you want to build it.
Which brings me on to a topic that I've heard about quite a lot in the impact scene, and that's mission drift. Do you think that founders also specifically look for impact investors that where the values align, like you said, in order to make sure that they don't experience that, mission drift?
Yes, definitely. And I think there are a lot of things, like with any startup, right? If you think about how often startups need to pivot and change their business model slightly and make tweaks along the way, this is definitely a risk. One of the things that we try to look for is business models where the impact is inherent, right? So there is a lockstep model. If your revenue grows, your impact grows. But it's then when you look at sort of the nuances of this, and if you think about impacting, delivering education to people, there are different levels of this, right? So one level of impact could be how many people do you reach? The other level is how deep does your impact go? So how much of an individual impact do you have on each of them? And actually, in scaling the business, those two might be conflicting, right? You might either go for many more people, or you might go for really deep impact with a smaller group. So I think there is a lot in the impact space that is still developing, that people are still figuring out how to put metrics around, how to measure, how to incentivize, which is why so much of this conversation, open conversation, is needed.
Is that also part of how you align, maximizing return or maximizing impact, is to figure out models where when the return grows, the impact grows?
That is definitely one of them. But fundamentally, I have to say, I don't really agree that the two are in conflict, because that's how they often get talked about, right? Because if we think about impact, what are aspects, and I'm not saying this is true for every type of impact, I know there are nuances within this, but the kind of businesses that we look for operate in really large markets. So if you think about climate tech, you think about silver tech, you think about health tech, trillion-dollar markets, right? So enormous markets. They solve hair on fire problems. So problems that are really urgent for people, that people are willing to spend money on, which makes for a great business model. And they solve in a mission-driven or purpose-driven way, which means they get better, more committed, more loyal employees, better relationships with customers, better relationships with suppliers. So I think in these spaces, building a business in this space just ticks so many boxes in terms of what a great startup needs, that I don't see why there should be a conflict between the impact and the returns or the profit.
The way that impact is portrayed sometimes as a counterpart or detrimental to maximizing profits, is there any science behind that?
I'm not sure there is. I mean, I think we can see right now where that kind of mindset has gotten us, right? And I think a lot of us can see that something needs to change. And actually, I think impact entrepreneurship is one of the most powerful problem-solving tools that we have for the poly crisis right now.
I agree. And that the narrative we've been told, by seeing what kinds of businesses grow massively in scale, the narrative we've been told is either you make money or you do good. Either you're a massive oil company, pharmaceutical, or whatever, or you're an NGO. And I guess what you're saying is, no, you can be both.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of changing the narrative.
And I think there are many more examples of this. So obviously we operate in the early stage startup space. So a lot of the companies, not many people might know, but it goes all the way to companies the size of Patagonia, right? When exactly. They converted their structure, it was a massive news item and lots of people got involved in the conversation. So I think it's happening across the spectrum, across different types of organizations, different sizes of organizations.
Let's get back to the topic we started off with, which is that some founders, especially underrepresented founders, there's a possible struggle with power dynamics, with, for example, asking for money or asking for any kind of favor. What would your advice be for obviously underrepresented founders, but also just generally impact founders? How can they overcome that inner sense of power misalignment, or the power differential?
I think it takes a lot of work. It's not something where you just snip your fingers and it's done. But I think the first step to it is realizing that it's there, and also realizing that there is an opportunity to rephrase, to going from asking for something to offering an opportunity. And then I think if you can find examples of entrepreneurs who've done this successfully through programs, through networking events, through LinkedIn, whatever it is, right? Actually learning from that as well, and trying it out. And like I said, it's a journey. It's something that you have to learn, and we had to learn as well. because it's not an easy thing to just switch your mindset. But it's also very liberating.
Yeah. Is part of it also just encountering investors as human beings? I mean, not thinking of them as the money givers, or trying to break down the wall between what are sometimes experienced. You've got founders on the one side and the investors on the other.
100%, yes. And also more investors lifting the hood a little bit, right? Explaining actually how their models work and what their pressures are, what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So that there can be a real understanding, because I think lots of people have understood, in quotation marks, how the VC model works, without actually having thought through what this means for them in terms of taking money and then growing their business. Mm-hmm. So if you think of a VC fund usually being sort of running for a 10-year time horizon, and then you get investment in their year 2 or 3, that just in terms of the math is a limited period of time during which they can generate returns on their investment, which means that the time that you have to grow the business to a certain size just is very limited. And then we need these businesses that grow really fast. But we also have met a lot of founders that were sort of disgruntled at the end of the process because they hadn't fully understood this and no one had told them. A lot of the conversation is not very transparent still, right? So I think there is a lot more in that, sort of thinking through, sharing experiences, talking through how the model works and what that actually means for you as a founder when you come up with your fundraising strategy. And final thing, also, maybe taking VC as a funding method off the pedestal a little bit, because it is not the only way for businesses to get funded, right? There are many different options, some of them even non-dilutive. So actually thinking of getting VC investment as the one and only measure of success for a startup is, again, I think, a preconception that needs to change.
Imagine you had like, let's say 10 VC managers or VC investors lined up, and they're all meeting startups. And as you just described, I would see that part of their job would be to also communicate and educate the startup founders on, the more nuanced components of what it means to get a VC investment. Now, out of these 10 VC investors, how many of those would you give, I don't know how your grading system, an A+, right? How many of those would you give an A+ in their skill that they have in communicating with founders and educating founders on these nuances? Sorry, I lost the sound for a moment. I didn't hear what you actually said.
Probably not enough.
Not enough.
But you equally get some great VCs, right? We've co-invested with some amazing people who actually do look at the startup founders as human beings and do have great conversations with them. There just needs to be across, I'm going to say, the industry in general, there needs to be a bit more of that, just more of a shift. And maybe it's also because I live in this impact bubble where people are generally more collaborative, share more have more open conversations. But I think there's a little bit of that bubble that could maybe go over to different parts of the VC ecosystem.
Yeah, but you didn't give me a number. How many get A+? This is not against any VC, but everybody's got certain kinds of skill sets, right? And this might just be a skill set that might be something that even VCs can work on.
Yeah, I'm going to say less than half of them, because it's equally, if you think of every VC seeing somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 deals a year, very, very few are going to take the time to have these kind of conversations, right?
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, then maybe a bit of the responsibility of the ecosystem. So when you have acceleration programs, incubation programs, fundraising programs, foundations that are putting together materials, best practice materials and such. So I think there is a bit of an onus on everyone to make this whole space a bit more transparent.
So it's not just the VCs who've got to be very good at communicating and educating these nuances.
Well, I think that would be a very black and white way of looking at it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But as a founder, okay, last question on this topic, okay? But I know I'm grilling you a bit on this one because it's so fascinating from the founder perspective, right? But as a founder, if you've got a VC sitting across from you, and you try to have build a good relationship, have a good collaborative conversation, and he's throwing some jargon at you that you just really don't get. Now, of course, you could say, well, the founder should have done their research. Okay, granted. But this person's willingness to explain that jargon and the nuances of what he's saying, that willingness is zero. How bad is that for a founder? I mean, should a founder try to continue, building this relationship, or should they say like, maybe not? What's your intuition tell you?
I think the question to ask yourself is whether you would like to work with that person in this kind of way for the next 5 to 10 years. Because you're entering a very long-term relationship, right? Yeah. This is not something that is going to be over when the fundraising closes. Mm-hmm. This is a long-term relationship. And so the intention, and I think everyone has good intentions in terms of the investors as well, in terms of helping their portfolio companies figure out their problems along the way. So I would look at it, again, in terms of the power dynamics, when you have these conversations, the interview goes both ways, right?
Yes.
It's not just the investors getting to know the founders, it's also the founders getting to know the investors.
Mm-hmm. Because you gave this example of a founder who just managed very, very well to build networks, to start building these relationships, do the outreach and build relationships with investors. Have you seen any other founders who've done that exceptionally well? Where you felt like, these people are just asking all the right questions. They're curious about me as an investor.
Yeah, definitely. We've invested in some of them, right? So definitely there are more examples.
And what? Tell me about them.
There is one of the companies that we invested in is a female founder building a sort of a climate tech solution for circularity around high value electronics. Mm-hmm. And I think she did a phenomenal job in terms of reaching out to people, building a relationship, actually being very interested and asking great questions, but then also doing a phenomenal job at keeping people updated and saying, oh, by the way, I've done this and I've done this, and what do you think about that? And so it's sort of, before we even invested, it turned into a conversation and an ongoing conversation, which then meant that by the time we got to the investment decision, we already knew a lot about how this founder works and how she likes to develop and how well she delivers on her deadlines. I mean, I'm baffled every time I speak to her how much she can get done within short periods of time.
Wow. You said just now asking great questions. What's a great question to ask an investor?
One of the conversations that I think is great when founders have this is around valuations, because I think this is a black box for a lot of early stage founders. Sort of just having conversations around what people are seeing in the space, how it's developing, especially with the last couple of years that we've had. There are lots of macroeconomic things happening, but then lots of things happening within specific industries. An example being climate tech being much more resilient in terms of the valuations and the performance of the businesses, for example, the funding that goes to them. But that's sort of having a conversation where they try to learn and get information from people who do this as a day job, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Meaning you.
Yeah, investors.
Other investors.
Yeah. Another thing, sorry, and this goes back, I think, to the I think it goes back to the sort of interviewing each other question. I think there are a lot of great questions around, values and ways of working, and what are they trying to achieve with their fund or their investor, how they work with startups. If you're doing some sort of acceleration program, how much that is, a cookie cutter sort of one size fits all versus how much is actually tailored to the businesses. And so it's really, again, that sort of questions around a specific relationship that you are going to have, working relationship and human relationship. if you were to work together.
Which, takes the imagination or requires the imagination to, envision that long-term relationship, right? To say like, okay, this is what it's going to be like maybe 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road.
Yeah, it does. It does. But I mean, every founder goes out with a business plan that covers the next 5 years, right? So on paper, they have all done thinking about what it looks like. I know reality is not always what you model in an Excel spreadsheet, but I think it's really important for founders to do in terms of this long-term planning, because if you are trying to build a unicorn type business, you're going to go about it very differently. If you're trying to build a business that ultimately you can sell to an industry player, you're going to build it very differently from a business that you're trying to IPO. It's sort of, all of these different aspects, even if they don't pan out the way you planned them, it's good, I think, to work through and to figure out what's your fundraising strategy, what is your strategy for growing the business, and what kind of people do you want to have on your side as you do it.
Start with the end in mind.
Give a bit of thought to the end. There's obviously a lot of focus that has to be on the next steps and on the delivering. And if you start planning your IPO on day one, I'm not sure you'll ever get there. So I think it's more give a bit of thought to the end.
Okay, give a bit of thought to the end. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, and also to the role that the investors play, along that journey, and they're going to be beside you during that entire journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Last question. Next to last question.
I'm sure you said this a few times now.
Yeah, probably have. I'm like, let's wrap it up. No, I've enjoyed our interview so much. Thank you.
Me too.
But seriously, next to last question. So who would you like to suggest as a future podcast guest for this podcast?
There are a lot of great people. Can I send you a list?
Oh, please send me a list. Yeah.
Okay.
That's
I'll
wonderful.
send you a list.
Okay. Thank you. Then the final question is, if you had to choose one, okay, what would be one impact that you'd love to help create on a humongous scale, okay? Maybe even through the empowerment of not just one startup, but an entire ecosystem of startups. What would be that one top priority impact?
More diversity and inclusion, because I think that brings just different perspective, different points of view, different ways of solving problems that if you only take one very limited group of people, you might not even know exist. So I think bringing diverse people from diverse backgrounds, diverse points of views, diverse upbringings, etc., together and into the space on both the entrepreneurial side as well as the funding side.
Thank you very much. And that would also then mean that, you can't have businesses that have business practices that negatively impact diverse people, just because they haven't got a clue about what they need, right?
As well. And then probably if they truly manage to build diverse and inclusive teams, have many different voices heard. So even if they do go down the wrong path, there is someone who can speak up and say, actually, guys, have you thought about this?
I like that. Yeah. Actually, have you thought about this? We could have used some of those voices in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I'm not saying there were obviously a lot of voices that raised concerns regarding all kinds of issues, right? But to have them in the central roles, in the leading teams of businesses, and
in decision-making positions and with capital to allocate. Yeah.
Let's lift diversity up into that field.
All right. It's a deal.
It's a deal. Alina, I'm going to post your contact infos in the show notes. So if people want to reach out to you, let's make sure they do, right? Let's keep that pipeline open.
Yep.
And I want to thank you again so much for coming on to my podcast today, talking to investors, and for your time and for all the insights that you brought into this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been really fun, and I think you do a phenomenal job with this. So I can't wait to listen to your next episode and the one after that and the one after that.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss an episode. And please do share this podcast with any impact founders you know who might benefit from better understanding the investor mindset and from thinking about what that really means: impact. Let's start this discussion between startup founders and investors about impact in the spaces of circularity, sustainability, and regeneration. Thank you.